Hello and welcome to focusIR. I am John Hughman and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Mark Lebbell, who is Senior Analyst at Utilico Emerging Markets. And today we're going to be talking about the megatrends, some of the megatrends shaping emerging market investing, and one in particular. Welcome, Mark.
Hello, John. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on. So the megatrend we're going to be talking about specifically today is digital. It's one of four megatrends that I know that Utilico focuses on, but digital is massive. It's everywhere. And I guess the best way to start is when we think about the digital economy, we often think about the US, big tech, the Mag 7, as though that's the only game in town. But Asia has very much its own digital economy, its own digital giants, and in many respects is perhaps in some areas more advanced than some of its Western counterparts. Mark, tell us about the digital economy in Asia and why it's so important to Utilico as a theme.
So it's a massively growing, globally. I think the whole digital economy that we're seeing, as you mentioned, we've seen the big tech giants in America, the Amazons, the Googles, etc. They're very dominant in Asia as well. But Asia's also got its own ecosystem. Whether that's sort of the likes of TikTok, PDD, which owns Temu. And all these sort of other, Tencent Cloud, etc., which are growing across Asia. We're seeing AI is very important, and we've seen the huge growth, I suppose, in 2024 in Nvidia, and there's been a lot of hype around that, and a lot of that comes out of Taiwan, Korea, Japan, even Malaysia, building a lot of servers, building data centers, etc. So it's an exciting time to be sort of investing in that area. But I should make it clear that Utilico Emerging Markets, we're investors in infrastructure. So we're investing in the digital infrastructure that delivers those services. So it's data centers, it's mobile phone operators, tower companies, fiber and broadband companies. So those companies that are joining, if you like, or facilitating these tech companies and these I suppose the e-commerce and social media companies, and allowing their services to get to the end consumer and to businesses.
So how advanced is that digital infrastructure in Asia? Perhaps when we compare it to the digital infrastructure here in the West.
Varies. I mean, I think some of our markets like Korea, way ahead of where we are here in terms of sort of very ubiquitous 5G coverage, 10 gigabit per second, fiber to the home, pretty much ubiquitous. But there's other countries that are very much further down, the road, where they're still seeing growth. There's something like the Philippines, for example, where fixed line penetration is about 20%. So there's a lot of growth there, and it's interesting because you're seeing at the moment a move where a lot of the sort of data and data services it's always quite discretionary spend, and now it's becoming more of an essential spend, a priority spend. So we're seeing people topping up more. Their services more often. It's changing the dynamic quite quickly in some of those more frontier and developing markets. So it's a real full spectrum, I suppose, across the whole UEM.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we're talking here about Asia, but emerging markets cover a much broader part of the globe than that. And I guess there are areas like you mentioned that are playing catch up, and some continents where that catch up and therefore the opportunity may be even greater. So Africa, for example, perhaps talk to us about that as a play.
It's been an interesting one in 2024. For a long time we've been investors in Africa, and it's quite there's huge growth. I mean, if you look at 4G is the way. There's not a lot of fixed line fiber. It's growing in sort of some affluent areas, but it's mostly about 4G mobile. And for many people, when they get the first 4G phone, that's the first time they've been on the internet. And we're seeing very strong growth across Africa in that, because handsets have got cheap enough, services have got cheap enough, and I suppose also there's a sort of compellingness of the applications that people are prioritizing spend into those areas. So we've seen very strong double digit growth in Africa this year. That's been going on for the last 2 or 3 years. So it's been very interesting. But the real, I suppose, difficulty of Africa investing at the moment has been sort of FX rates. So a lot of countries, whether it's Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, we've seen times where currencies have devalued quite significantly, and it makes it quite difficult to find your investments. So our biggest investment in Africa on the telecom side is in a company called Sonatel, which is based in Senegal. It's one of controlled by Orange, used to be France Telecom of France. So you've got very solid backing from a Western group, ownership from the government as well. And they're quite dominant in not just in Senegal, but in some of the neighboring countries as well. But interestingly, a lot of the countries in that region have got their currency pegged to the euros. They're in the sort of West African franc, which is a sort of a relic of colonial days, I guess. But it's still, so we're seeing double-digit growth there, but it's in euro terms, if you like. So it's a sort of a better way of playing that market rather than being in something that's very exposed to Nigerian naira, for example, or the Egyptian pound, which have suffered over the last couple of years at least with steep devaluations. So that's one way of playing it. The other way we're also investing in is some of the infrastructure in terms of the telecoms towers and the companies that deliver those services, and their customers are the mobile operators. They quite often price their contracts in US dollars or in euros. So again, you've got this hard currency, not fully 100%, but majority of your revenues are sort of generated in a sort of hard currency protection.
Yeah, just another layer of complexity to add to what must be, relatively complex. Finding the investments in emerging markets and actually managing some of the risks behind them. But can you talk perhaps through some of those, regulatory challenges, political challenges that you as an analyst, I guess, have to assess when you're going into these markets?
Yeah, I mean, regulation is always a difficult one across the infrastructure. Sometimes it can be helpful, and sometimes it can be a hindrance, I suppose. So we look at things like consolidation in markets is an important trend that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, where you perhaps have 4 or 5 mobile operators in the market, and they've been allowed to restructure the industry and allow, either the smaller player, as we saw in Brazil, got broken up amongst the 3 larger telcos, which gave a bit more scale to the industry as a whole. In other markets like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, in recent years, we've seen a consolidation of the markets that just helps everybody's, I suppose, margins, if you like, cash flows by, giving them more economies of scale. And for consumers, it means generally the company's got more money to invest in better services and in upgrading their infrastructure, etc. So it's a win-win. But, you do get some markets where, suddenly there's another new entrant comes in, and it does cause issues, I suppose, in with competition, etc. So that's one thing to look at. There's other things like data sovereignty, and this idea of having particularly government data held locally. As companies and governments move more into the cloud, they want to ensure that gets stored in a sort of local environment. So I think for some of the smaller countries, there's some opportunities there for data centers and things that where things, perhaps are stored in Singapore or Hong Kong or in the US. Traditionally, they're bringing it further back into their sort of local markets. So I think there's interesting things there. Outside of where we invest, I mean, one of the reasons we don't really invest perhaps in some of the e-commerce and social media spaces is the risk of regulation, particularly sort of China, US focus. But, you're seeing even in places like Indonesia, putting in sort of controls on things like Temu and TikTok and things, the sort of Chinese brands that are coming in, particularly on the e-commerce side. They're having to partner with local partners. And there's always a risk, I suppose, in those players that, the markets could be fundamentally changed or they're broken up, et cetera, et cetera. So, we keep an eye on those kind of things, but we're really, I suppose, investing in the things that connect those things to consumers. So there is regulation around particularly around competition, but generally, we keep an eye. But
yeah. Well, obviously, we saw in China recently there was a crackdown on sort of some of the big tech companies. I guess infrastructure is a safer place to be then, essentially, than these very sort of market driven.
I think so because China particularly has put in a lot of things. We've seen sort of things like number of hours that people can play games and that kind of thing. But there are issues out there, and there's some some regulation that needs to be tightened up, and whether the telcos play a part in now, the governments, I don't know. So, for example, come back from Indonesia, and they were saying there's a big issue of illegal online gambling, which is coming out of places like Cambodia. That's becoming a big social issue. So the telcos are trying to cut down on that. We've seen telecoms companies trying to cut down on things like sort of fraud and scams and that kind of thing. So these kind of things sort of fall somewhere with the telcos to try and manage. So it's another area of concern, I suppose, from investors.
I mean, another thing that strikes me about emerging markets, particularly Asia, is sort of the rapid development of the digital skill set, digital education that's taking place there, and that must be manna for you. This upskilling of the region in terms of digital. One country that stands out particularly in this respect is Vietnam. Perhaps talk about that as an example of how the digital education side of things is really having a profound impact.
Yeah, so Vietnam, we've got a company that we've invested in. Actually, it's grown from quite sort of humble beginnings, I suppose, to become one of the top holdings within the portfolio. It's a company called FPT, and it's a sort of almost a technology conglomerate. It's we initially were attracted because it's got a big sort of fiber broadband operation and data center operation in Vietnam, but its real growth driver has been in IT services. So effectively, it's a company that does work on behalf of global corporates, particularly Japanese companies, big car companies, etc., airlines, big manufacturers, and they're growing sort of 20-25% a year at the moment, quite consistently, and they're doing that not really by adding customers, but they're doing it by getting more work from their customers. So it's really sort of a snowball effect that they seem to be delivering value to their customers, and their customers are giving them a lot more work. But as they're growing, obviously they need more skilled more skilled workers. So as part of this, they've had a very long-term strategy of training and having. So they've actually got their own private education arm. It's got about 175,000 students in it, ranging from sort of primary school children all the way up to sort of university level vocational training. And I think what's interesting about Vietnam, it's dissimilar to China and some other markets, Singapore, etc., is there's a real push from parents and push from society on education, and particularly on the sort of STEM subjects, the science and maths subjects. And so you've got a sort of a fairly young workforce coming through, but a much higher standard education than you perhaps would expect. You're seeing similar things in India as well. In various areas. So I think this is quite an interesting aspect of what's going on. We talk a lot about positive demographics. It's not just really about birth rates, but it's about skill sets and education, and a lot of that is actually driven, ironically, by technology and by digital skills and by use of laptops and that kind of thing that are obviously much cheaper than perhaps they were 20 years ago.
Yeah, using technology in the right way, and one can only assume this will have a snowball effect throughout the region as other countries play catch up. Essentially, one of the things that's interesting there, you mentioned India, and obviously India was well known as the IT services hub. Now Vietnam is getting involved in IT services. China was the workshop of the world. Vietnam is now making high tech products. How closely do you have to keep an eye on all this sort of movement of industry around the continent?
Yeah, very, very closely, actually. As UEM as a whole, especially, because, we're talking about this as the digital infrastructure as a mega trend, but one of our other mega trends is really in that sort of global trade and logistics. And so we're very carefully monitoring what's going on. And as we talk, you've got, Donald Trump coming into the US, talking about all kinds of tariffs on China, on Mexico, even Canada. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I think over the last few years, you've seen this sort of China plus one policy, which is really a reaction to COVID, where everyone got caught out because they realized all their manufacturing was in China. And when COVID initially hit, way back in the early 2020, there was obviously this bottleneck in the supply chains, everything closed down temporarily. And I think people have been trying to diversify away from that. And we've seen this sort of idea of nearshoring coming in. But, the question is, what's the next 5 years going to be with next 4 years under Trump? And how does that change universe, etc.? So, we're monitoring it very closely, but it's pretty opaque at the moment as to what it will end up with. But I think there is a trend that, that people are trying to diversify away from China.
Yeah,
a bit.
Absolutely. A bit, yeah. I think China is pretty much a pretty key cog in the supply chain still, so might take some time. I guess the other thing you must be looking at, you mentioned global trade, is we've talked about the digital infrastructure itself, but I guess across UEM, you're looking at the impact of digital on companies in other sectors. How does that sort of how do you assess that digital readiness across the portfolio?
It's difficult to assess, but I think you can see the benefits of this in all kinds of ways, whether it's in terms of driving efficiencies, fault reporting, fault fixing for things, customer services, improved payments. I think payments are a very interesting area, which is rapidly becoming digitized, I guess, and that creates huge savings to companies that use a lot of cash or cash collection. So those kind of things are helping to drive efficiencies across the portfolio, I guess.
Yeah. Is there any truth as well in the we've talked about Africa, and we've talked about 4G being often the first experience many there have of the internet. Is there much truth in the idea that in sort of coming at digital late in some respects, it also offers advantages to certain countries that they're jumping the legacy aspect part and going straight to the good technology?
I think so. I think there's an element of that. I mean, you can see that in mobile payments. That people are jumping a lot of this sort of legacy banking and doing a lot of things in mobile payment space and QR code payments and instant payments and things like that. So we've seen some big moves in those kind of things where things move quite quickly. Brazil, they've got something called Pix, which is in some ways very similar to the sort of bank payments that we do in the UK. But it's a very sort of instant, very easy way to pay money across, which didn't really exist before. So all the banks have got together and done that, and that's really been quite transformative, I think, in that country. And in Africa, you're seeing huge strides in mobile money. So everything's on your phone, but you can do peer-to-peer payments or payments in the shops, take money out of an ATM even, just using your phone. So that's interesting. And then it's evolving into doing other things like microcredit, buy now pay later type services, savings, investing, etc. in those markets.
Yep, driving economic development, I guess, and thus growth at the end of the day.
It's all about optimization. I think a lot of these things are about I say these things. If you look at the digital, it's about innovation. It's about I suppose this optimization, this efficiency gains. You get it, and a lot of it's actually about trust as well. So you gaining sort of accountability, recordability, these kind of things. So it opens up new markets. So the whole thing with a taxi app or something like that, something like Grab in Asia or Uber, you need to have that certain level of trust to actually get in the stranger's cab. There's trust that you're going to pay at the end, etc., etc. And these digital things allow this kind of thing, and we're seeing that across the world. Not the e-governments of initiatives, things like companies having to effectively copy the tax office in when they send an invoice. So this is something that we've seen in places like Egypt. They're introducing it in Malaysia at the moment. And so they're trying, the idea of this is to try and sort of get rid of that sort of black economy reporting, etc. Try and increase tax collections through, I suppose, information trust and those kind of things. There's a whole sort of thing around governance and trust and which these digital things can provide.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a vast subject, and there is so much to keep on top of. What's your process? How do you go about keeping on top of the things that you need to know, that what's going on behind the megatrends. I guess you're out on the road a lot.
Yeah, I mean, we do try and obviously we monitor companies once their results, annual reports, and bits and pieces. Join various calls, I suppose, whether that's virtual or in London, or we go on the road. As you say, as a team, we travel quite extensively. Myself just come back from Southeast Asia, went to Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia this year. And it's fascinating to go and meet companies in their own countries, and you learn an awful lot about the ecosystem and what's going on. You hear opposing views, some people positive, some people negative, about certain things. I mean, generally quite positive, I think, for the whole trip. We try and go and visit assets. So we went to a number of data centers on this last trip. One in Kuala Lumpur, we went to one in Johor, which is the area, it's the state next door to Singapore, where there's an awful lot of data center investment going on. So we obviously some of the building work that's going on there, providing for, again, these sort of global companies, often, for TikTok and for Shopee, which is a big e-commerce company, service based out there. So not only just the Googles, the Amazons, and the Oracles, etc. But fascinating to go on the ground and see what's going on. So the process is it's a lot of reading, listening to things, meeting people, and trying to identify places where we can invest. I mean, we are investors in listed infrastructure, so we're investing in companies that are listed on stock exchanges around the world. So there's not always listed companies that play where we want to go, but there's plenty of choice. There's loads of companies to keep looking at and analysing, and new IPOs from time to time.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like a fascinating job, and I'm very jealous. I'm not going to ask you for a prediction for what's going to happen in big tech in 2025, but is there anything on the horizon that you're keeping a particularly close eye on?
I think we're keeping an eye on. I mean, one area that is a bit perplexing at the moment, or big question mark, is around the sort of AI processing. So we've seen Nvidia do a lot of deals with a number of telcos, some of them in our portfolio, to sell these GPU, these processing chips for AI. And the idea is that these telcos will put them in their data centers and then sell that capacity, that processing capacity, or GPU as a service, they call it, to companies. And so those companies are very bullish about this. I mean, it's only going to be a small part of their business, but they're very bullish about this and the prospects for this and et cetera, and what that means for them. I think share prices for these companies have reacted quite positively because it's good news. It's a good news story. It involves Nvidia. And I think 2025 will be when we actually see these things starting to be installed, and we'll start to see whether they actually make any commercial sense or not. The jury's out, I think, as to whether these guys can make a return before the technology goes obsolete, effectively. But they're telling us that they can make very strong returns on this kind of infrastructure, because it's a scarce commodity. But we'll see. So that's one thing that we're kind of watching. It's more out of interest. It's not going to dominate any of the companies that we've got, but there is some sort of skin in the game, I suppose, with those. But so that's an interesting one. But I think that whole AI is having an impact on the data center sector. It's an area that we're very interested in. And I think there's a lot of predictions for very strong growth in the data centers over the next 5 years, which is maybe over-optimistic, but we'll see. But in the short term, we have seen this sort of almost slowing down of people signing checks and making decisions, because technology is changing so fast. They're kind of umming and ahhing as to what they're going to do this year and next year. So that's one thing that we've noticed. The long-term prospects very strong. Short-term, a little bit of a pause going on in some of those data center investments.
Classic technology cycles. But there you go. Mark, it's an absolutely fascinating space, and thank you so much for sharing your insights into it.